quickly go over some objectives and norms before we get started. So just want to be clear about what we're going to be doing today and what's expected. So today, participants will be able to explore their own personal identity. So we're going to talk a little bit about who we are so that we can better understand the different parts of our own identity as we dig into how our identities, the different components of our social identities intersect. And then discussing why we think about some aspects of our identity more than other aspects of our identity. And then we'll develop some strategies and goals around discussing our identity with students and peers. So this is kind of the breakdown of our agenda. Hopefully we'll get through it pretty quick and you guys will have a little bit of a break before you head to the lunch panel. But we're doing these welcome and norms. We'll get into social identities and intersectionality. You guys will have the opportunity to break out, but we're a pretty small but mighty group. So we might just stay full group, do a full group share out, and then we'll get into the strategy building. So a call to action. What will you do starting tomorrow that will move these conversations forward with yourself as well as with your students and your colleagues? If you have any questions, please feel free to jot them in the chat. I will be watching out for the chat as well as Erica. So we want to make sure that we can answer your questions in real time. You are also welcome to use the little raise hand tool, unmute yourself and ask the question to the full group. So right now, what I want to just do is do some quick introductions. So Erica gave me a really nice introduction. As she mentioned, I currently serve as the Director of Racial Equity at the Mind Trust. And I also just, I launched a consulting business for diversity and equity around education and youth serving organizations. My why is really important to me. So I want to highlight that, why it is that I do the work that I do. I identify as an Afro-Latina, and every single day I choose to show up and do this work for my nieces, my nephews, my families, and all of the Afro-Latinx kids and students out there who really just need to see someone that looks like them doing this work in these spaces and facilitating the work and leading the work. Our community is very, very diverse. And I feel like it's my responsibility to make sure that we are uplifting even the folks that are marginalized within our own community. So with that being said, if you all can take some time, we're small, so let's actually just unmute ourselves. And I just want your name, your title or your role, what it is you do, if you want to share that, and then one word to describe how you're feeling in this space, right? This is a big deal, coming to a conference that's made for us and by us, for Latinx educators. So if you can just share how you're feeling in the space today. Whoever wants to go first.
Buenos días, I'm Angie Brito Rodriguez. I am coming as a founding steering committee member for Access, a Latinx development program for young professionals here in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm lit to be in this space and so excited to be with the homie, the CEO, Lauren Lopez, as she leads us in this really important conversation.
Thank you, Angie. We got Carla, Emily. If you want to put in the chat or unmute yourself, whatever's comfortable and able for you to do.
I can go next. Hopefully it's not too loud in here. But hi, everyone. My name is Carla Marquina. I'm here in Kansas City. I lead the Avanzando Latino Mentoring Program, which is a mentoring program for Latinx students at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. And Emily is here. She is excited to join the conversation. She is a high school ESL teacher in North Carolina. Wow. I hope you're safe over there. I have family in South Carolina. I know Hurricane Ian is kind of going through the coastal area over there. So hopefully you're staying safe and your family is safe during this time. So we're going to go ahead and move forward. Oh man. Yeah. I just got a picture this morning from my sister of a boardwalk like falling into the water in Myrtle Beach. So hoping all people and all folks are safe during this time, especially We have lots of hurricanes kind of ravaging through, especially Latinx populated areas. So sending out good thoughts, prayers for those who are being affected by these tragedies. So we're going to quickly go through some norms. We're all adults, you guys can read, but I definitely want to give you all time. If you see anything that you want added to this list, or you want to make sure that we center as we enter into this conversation, or if you want to call out specifically one of these norms. So I'm going to call out expect and accept non-closure. We have 40 minutes, a little less than that, about 30 minutes left, right? So we might not get very deep into conversation or all of your questions or thoughts or opinions. We might not have the most time to share everything. So I just want a norm for us that we can expect to leave some things hanging, to leave some things in the parking lot, and that's okay. My real goal for everyone is to be able to start having these conversations outside of just these spaces where we're dedicating time to it. But how do you make sure you are incorporating conversations like this in your day-to-day talk with peers, with colleagues, and with students? Is there any other norms that we want to call out or add to this list? All right, we'll go ahead and move forward. So, stay engaged, Angela. Yes, stay engaged. We got 30 minutes. So if you could just hold on tight for 30 minutes with us, I will make sure I get you guys out of here on time and with enough time to transition. So what I really want to do is, I didn't send out handouts. I'm sure folks have seen an identity wheel. If not, this is an amazing place to start your identity journey. These are all of the most common aspects of one's identity. So we have race, ethnicity, national origin, first language, gender, sex, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, ability. So that is being able-bodied or having any potential like learning disabilities or mental disabilities. All of those things kind of play into that component. Religion, age, immigration status. So these are the most common aspects of one's identity. So I want you guys to take a minute and think about all of the labels that you have within these identities. For example, race, I identify as multiracial, but my ethnicity is Puerto Rican, right? Those are two different things. Sometimes I love getting into that conversation, especially with the Latina community. We are multiracial people. And we have to start understanding what that means and being able to engage in conversations about it. But my national origin is the United States. I was born in the US and raised in the US. So yeah, I just want you to take a minute, think about all of these aspects of your identity. Figure out where you sit in those labels. What are the labels or the terms that you would use to describe yourself in these different categories? And now in the chat, I want you to put, which category do you think about the most? Thank you, Carla. Erica, feel free to jump in if you also want to participate. Okay. Oh, there you go. Okay, Angie. Anybody else? Which category do we think of the most? This is probably the most diverse answers I've ever gotten doing this activity. Does anybody want to unmute and share a little bit about what about that category keeps it on your mind?
I can go ahead. So last year, I found out that I was autistic. which again, at the age of 27, which came in, everything made sense finally. I already knew that I was struggling, but finally giving it a name and finally knowing that, again, there was nothing wrong with me. It was just, again, living in a world that was not designed with me in mind, made everything change. Everything had more meaning. And again, it was very validating, but at the same time, it put everything into perspective about different things that I hadn't realized before, different things of why things played out the way they did. Why was I struggling the way that I did? And now it's time, almost like trying to reheal from everything that has gone through my life, realizing again, like traumas that I didn't even realize were there because I was finally being able to confront them and finding ways again of, am I really doing things that are for me, or am I doing things because it was expected from a neurotypical world, from an holistic world? And how am I making sure that my students are not struggling the same way that I did? I'm making the place inclusive for everyone.
Wow. Thank you so much, Carla, for sharing that. And something you said, and I'm paraphrasing, that I really want to highlight, that really struck a chord with me was something along the lines of, I realized I was existing like in a space that wasn't designed for me. And I think that might be a common thing we think about. For example, I constantly am thinking about race/ethnicity and my intersections of those two things. And it's because this country was not built to see brown and Black people succeed, thrive, be successful, move up, achieve, be excellent. And I think that's a common thread when we think about some of our identities a lot more than our other components of our identity. Anybody else want to share what has you thinking about these different things more than other components?
Race is often top of mind for me because it's what people notice and speak on the most within Latino circles. Even though I am Dominican from both parents, born in Dominican Republic, Spanish is my first language. Whenever I open my mouth to say something in Spanish, people are always taken aback. Where did you learn Spanish? Who taught you? And it's not normalized that I'm a Black Latina native speaker. So it often comes to mind as I navigate different circles. And as a natural haired Latina too, all these questions about my hair and its texture and wanting to touch it, I think are all deeply connected to me, to my identity as a Black Latina. So it's the forefront because I feel like it's the ignorance that I'm typically caused to confront, and that I, in my trauma, am often engaging with my fist up, ready to defend myself and speak to that.
Got it. Thank you, Angie, for sharing. I appreciate it. So now I want you all to pivot. Which identities on this wheel do you think of the least? So 1 or 2 identities, you can drop them in the chat. Which ones do you think about the least? And then we'll have a couple people share out as well why they think they might not think about those identities as much. Thank you, Carla. Again, we're just dropping in the chat. Which area do we think about the least? Yeah. So if I can have a couple folks share out again, why do you think it is that you don't think about these specific pieces of your identity as much as others?
In my case, I think it's because since I identify as heterosexual and we live in a very heteronormative society, I come from a point of privilege. Therefore, it is not something that sometimes is like oh, right, like I have to constantly, my identity is not constantly being either picked on. It's not constantly being the one that people are focusing on. Mine is quote unquote considered the norm. Therefore, it's like power imbalance that makes me not think about it that often when it comes to myself.
Thank you, Carla. I'll share a little bit. Personally, I also don't really think about my sexual orientation and religion. They're probably the least things I think about. I think about religion as in I just moved somewhere and I'm looking for a new church, but like in my day-to-day life, most people around me are Christian. I identify as Christian. So it's not really something I need to think of. If I make references towards my Christianity, people don't cringe or look at me any type of way because it's very normal here in the US for folks to be Christian. Yeah, so I don't think about that as much. We have a video to watch and I want to make sure we have time to watch the whole video. So I'm going to move us past to do the quick intro to intersectionality. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and get started.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
So before we even get into digging deeper into the definition of intersectionality or digging deeper into kind of discussion around what was said, was there anything that really stood out for you in the video? If you want to just drop it in the chat. Don't worry, we'll get your comments in the discussion portion. So real quick, can I have somebody unmute and read us this definition of intersectionality?
The ways in which systems of inequity based on gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and other forms of discrimination intersect to create unique dynamics and effects that compound for the individual experiencing them.
So something here that I really want to focus on is the word compound. So these are really if you think about the reasons why we think so much about certain aspects of our identity, right? So Angie mentioned she thinks the most about race. That's because that's an area, if you identify as a person of color in this country, chances are you do not have privilege within that aspect of your identity. So we think about it the most because it's an area where we don't have privilege, where the systems and the way the country was built was not designed for that identity to thrive within it. When we look at intersectionality, we're looking at all of the areas where we intersect and we don't have privilege. So I am a woman. I don't have privilege in that area. This is a man's world, right? I identify as Afro-Latina. That makes me Black. That means I do not exhibit privilege in that area. So Kimberly Crenshaw mentioned that young Black girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended, and that it's not just a race problem, and it's not just a gender problem, but it's probably together an intersection of those two things that compound for those young Black girls in schools that is causing them to be suspended more, right? So this is where we get into the discussion. So what are some other examples of issues or intersections of identity that folks may experience that might be compounding discrimination for them? Did that make sense, the question? I can ask it differently. So another example would be a male who identifies as gay, who is also a person of color, right? So that person is potentially being excluded or marginalized from their Black community, but also being marginalized from the gay community because of his race. So those two identities intersecting are compounding and not allowing that individual to fit into spaces that technically were designed for him, technically were designed for that person to feel welcome. But because of the intersection of both his race and sexual orientation, that is causing additional discrimination on top of just being Black or just being gay. Yes, Angela, being a trans faith leader. It's difficult for folks to be in the church and identify and be LGBTQ, right? So how do you show up in spaces that were designed without you in mind, right? And how do those things, as they intersect and come together, how are they further marginalizing, can't say that word. How are they further putting folks on the margins? And now I want you to think specifically about students who probably have no concept of their self-identity, are not super aware of who they are when they show up in spaces, maybe not aware that certain spaces were not designed for them, or maybe are aware of it, but don't really know how to communicate it, right? What are the ways in which students' identities are intersecting and causing them to feel not welcome in the spaces that they're supposed to be in, like a school building? What are the ways in which school culture is being perpetuated that is further pushing students to the margin, maybe without us realizing? Just keep that at the front of your mind. We did kind of the discussion a bit. Are there any other examples where we might see intersections of one identity being compounded with discrimination. Oh, thank you, Carla, for that. Can you unmute and share a little bit? Because I'm not aware much about the neurodivergent community.
Sure. So for those who don't know, neurodiversity basically talks about that basically all brains are valid. There's something that we call neurodivergent that basically means it's an umbrella term, such as like person of color. You can be a person of color and identify as many different groups. It's the same thing with neurodivergent. You can identify with many different conditions and still be part of the neurodivergent umbrella. When we're talking specific, one of the two top ones that are most commonly talked about is ADHD and autism. Specifically talking about autism, those assigned female at birth are less likely to be identified as a young age because for some reason, those assigned female at birth, we tend to be better at what we call masking, which is a survival mechanism that we do, where we pretty much are acting the entire time, trying to put up at the front that everything is okay, and we try to assimilate into the culture, the neurotypical culture that we have overall. Therefore, we are not recognized and our signs get missed at a young age, not because we actually are not struggling, just because we're really good at hiding them. Also, if you've ever talked to someone about like what autism is, they will many times say like, "Oh, my little nephew's friend is autistic, and it's most likely a young boy, and the boy is white." I can't remember the exact numbers. I believe it was with African American populations. For every white boy that was identified as autistic, for every almost like two white boys that were identified as autistic is one African American boy. For the Latino community, I believe it's a 1.5 to 1. But when it comes to those assigned female at birth, for every girl that is identified as autistic, it's 4 to 5 boys that have been identified as autistic at a young age.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. And a lot of times, right, like even the data doesn't take into account the intersections. So even when we disaggregate data, we'll disaggregate racially, we'll disaggregate by gender, but we never look into the cross sections of those numbers as it relates to, okay, what about specifically Latino girls? What about specifically Black boys, right? Often many big corporations, people who are pushing out the data, are disaggregating a little bit, but are they really looking into the intersections that create the most marginalized people? And what does that data really say about ourselves, about our community, about our students, right? And this is big, especially in education, when we think of achievement data, right? So even when you're going on like a statewide website to get achievement results, at least in Indiana, we can like look up the achievement results for the state test, and they'll disaggregate by gender, they'll disaggregate by race, but I can never find the data or the information specifically for gender within a racial category, or gender or race within the socioeconomic category, right? So we're not getting the data of the most marginalized folks within those categories as it is, which doesn't help move the needle or move the conversation when we're really thinking about who is it within our communities that we really need to be serving. All right, so why does all of this matter? So these are just some like basic words, but I want to dig into them a little bit deeper. We have to be self-reflective and aware. When we understand our own identities, things that we think about the most, things that we think about the least, and we understand the complexities and the intersections of our identities, it can help us build empathy for the identities of others, right? So we spend a little bit of time talking about the identities that we never think about. Many of us said that ability was an identity that we never think about. And Carla said it was the identity she thinks about the most, right? So when we can understand what we never think about, we can be empathetic and take into account the fact that there are people in our communities, our friends, our family, our students, who those identities are at the top of their mind all the time. And then I love this phrase, hurt people hurt people. And when we have not taken the time to reflect on our own biases, our own identities, and our values, and the ways in which all of those components both influence and impact the way we show up in spaces, we respond out of those biases, out of those values that we've not reflected on. And instead of bringing our best selves, we might be hurting people because we're not realizing that we have things that we need to unpack and heal ourselves and within ourselves. Also, if we are not doing the self-work first, how can we expect and hold other people accountable to doing that same self-work, right? So when we're showing up in spaces like this, when we are taking time on a Saturday morning to say that we want to reflect on who we are, we want to reflect on our practices because we care about our kids, about our students, about the people who are around us, we then allow other people around us, we give them permission to also reflect, to also be accountable, to also understand that they have biases as well. And when we can name our biases, name the areas that we fall short, we are allowing people in our space permission to be vulnerable and fall short too. And that it's okay because we have each other's back, right? And then the final piece I always think about is when we know better, we do better. So when we are aware of our identities, our biases, the complexities of the intersections of our identity, the inequities that exist around our communities, right? Like we may not be thinking about ability, but because we're in classrooms and we are serving students who are thinking about those things, we do better because we're aware, because we know better. And we can show up better for our students in our classrooms, show up better for the peers and the colleagues in our workplaces, and show up better for the family and friends in our communities. Because we can name it and we can improve it, and then we do better for the kiddos that we serve. So what are some other reasons why you might think that this work is important? Why do we take time to have conversations about this?
For me, when I've talked sometimes with my students, even the younger ones, if there comes a question about like basically having to pick which part of your identity you will identify with today and which part of your identity will pretty much get attacked that day. Because oftentimes when, at least in my experience, when sometimes there are conversations about diversity, they pick pretty much like one aspect of diversity and all the conversation focuses on it. It's almost like today we're going to talk about this and the next day we're going to talk about that. But there's not enough conversation about intersectionality and how, again, like you mentioned, like how are our students feeling when one of their identities is feeling validated in a moment or is feeling acknowledged, but the other one is not. I know, like even in my own experiences, for example, when in my previous job, there was one day that I was having a really hard time writing an email because I was trying to make sure that everything made sense, and it was my autism was acting up that day, not letting me finish. But my supervisor was like, "Why can't you just send it? Just send it away." And I told her like, "No, because if I make a typo or something like that, and people see my name, they're not going to think about my autism. They're going to think about the fact that I'm Latina, and I'm probably that Latina who doesn't know how to speak English, doesn't know proper grammar. Therefore, I can't afford to make mistakes on two fronts. My disability front, my autism front, and also the fact that I am a Latina woman in this workplace environment." And she was like, "Oh, I've never thought about it that way." And I was like, "I'm happy you don't have to go through those struggles. I'm happy for you, but this is my reality. And this is the things that I go through."
Yeah, thank you so much, Carla, for sharing. We're going to head into, so we know why it's important, right? We have to think about it. We have to show up in spaces. We have to be able to advocate for students, especially and help them develop the language to advocate for themselves as well. So how do we get better? And these are just some strategies that I use, that I've been using really over the past 10 to 12 years to really push myself on my equity journey, but to help others around me join in on the equity journey themselves. So one of the ways that's really helped me is to ask questions and provide subtle correction. So I'm a pretty vocal person. I grew up in a family with 4 other siblings in the house. We were a very loud group. So a lot of like speaking over and demanding space, and not always in the most respectful or positive way, I'll say that. But as I've gotten older, I've learned that that is not the best way to bring people into the conversation and to give them space to feel safe enough to go there. So now what I do is I ask a lot of questions. I seek to learn more and to understand why it is or what is influencing folks in the way that they show up to spaces. So specifically, if something's not feeling right to you, one, it probably isn't feeling right to other people who are experiencing it or witnessing it. So if there are other folks around you and something's not feeling right, sometimes we have to be the ones to step up and intervene, and to make it aware that, hey, this is not sitting right with me. Something's not right, and I'm going to call it out. But I always find ways to call it out in a subtle or a questioning way. So for example, if you hear a joke about a specific group or community, instead of like, yo, that's not right, like that was rude, or that's disrespectful, or that's racist, instead of immediately going to judging someone and kind of attacking their character or who they are, I move to ask questions. What did you mean by that? You know, I don't move to laugh. I say, what did you mean by that? Right. And it gives them an opportunity to kind of unpack what it is that they're actually saying and make the own realization for themselves. Right. They get to have the light bulb moment without you potentially ruining a friendship, ruining a relationship, or burning a bridge. Another example, so this literally just happened to me this week. There was a coworker who was kind of using offensive language when he was talking about folks who are experiencing homelessness. And he just kept saying, yeah, there were just homeless people everywhere, and they were just like coming up to the tables, and oh my gosh, like the homeless people were just everywhere. And he just kept like nailing it in. And instead of correcting, very like bluntly, I just went into my comment and said, yeah, it's really unfortunate that there are so many folks in our community who are experiencing homelessness. I wonder what the city is doing to help. So I've just kind of reframed the conversation in a way that gets him to see like, hey, I don't really like the way you're talking about this community of people. So I'm going to reframe the conversation without really calling you out or making you feel like crap. And then the next thing that I think I've done to get better is continuous learning and development, right? So just taking the time to figure out, where are my blind spots? Where are my biases at? So I've done the Harvard implicit association test. I would encourage everyone to do it. And it'll tell you kind of, there are like 12 different tests, and you can take all of them, and it'll kind of tell you where your biases lie. And then you can go ahead and do research around, how do I get better at recognizing how those biases show up when I'm in spaces? You can find trainings and books and podcasts and all different ways to kind of move yourself out of just responding in that bias to naming the bias before you respond and then putting it in the back seat, right? And then the biggest thing I think is to invite people in. Bring people into the conversation with you, show your excitement about the work that you're doing and the self-work that you're doing, highlight the impact that the work that you've done has had on your students and the peers around you. Invite them to the workshops you're going to, invite them to the conferences, invite them to read the book with you, invite them to a book club. and tell them that you just want an accountability buddy, right? Like, don't make it about like, hey, I know you need to get better at this. Make it about you. Say, hey, I really need an accountability buddy. Could you read this book with me? Could you discuss this chapter with me? And then share your journey. Be proud of the work that you're doing, because I'm a big fan of like, when you shine your light, you give permission to other folks to shine theirs, to join in on the conversation. So when folks are invested in the journey with me, they are empowered and inspired to start their own journey for themselves or for their family or for their community or for their classroom. And at the end of the day, when we make ourselves better and hold our colleagues to the same expectations, we are creating an inclusive culture that honors the identities of ourselves and our students. Anything else that anyone might want to add to strategies that you can use to get better? And then we'll wrap up. Oh, thank you. All right. So at the end of the day, this is all for the kids, right? We show up every day into the work. We choose every day that we are excited to get to do the work, to serve our students. So what I want you to do, really, this call to action is really think about how you can model these types of conversations with your students, how we can engage in these conversations with our students. And then these are some things I always think to remember when you're getting into conversations with students. One, you always want to start with relationship building. So make sure you have a strong relationship with a student before you start digging into potential trauma or identity concerns that they might have, because there needs to be trust on both sides. But sometimes we have to put ourselves in the gap and be able to share appropriate stories with students that allow them to peel back the layers a bit for you. And then listen to what they have to say and ask them what they're looking for, what they need out of the conversation. And as you're listening to their story, you want to validate their feelings, right? Everyone has feelings and emotions, and the way in which you respond in those feelings is never wrong, because later you can get into the actions that the students can have, but the feelings are always going to be raw. And you want to make sure they understand that you are providing comfort, and you want to validate those feelings. And then once you have that relationship and they trust you and they're able to open up to you, you want to find ways to dig a little deeper. And then when ready, move to next steps and action with students. And this is your call to action. This is where I'm going to wrap up. I encourage you to screenshot it and share it out with the hashtag EVO22. What are some of the biases that you have? And if you don't know, what are you going to do tomorrow to find out what your biases are? Thank you so much, Delia. And then what is your goal for the next 90 days to improve your ability to engage in these types of conversations around bias and discrimination with your students, with your peers, family, friends, etc.? What goal are you setting for yourself to move forward? And that's kind of where I want to leave you. If you have questions or whatnot, if you scan this QR code, it'll take you to my information that's on the screen as well.